fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Welcome to Varn Vlog. This is a solo episode, and I don't do a lot of these anymore. But I was inspired after a conversation with a friend and a conversation with a coworker who I have some fondness for, even though you won't be able to tell it from my monologue today. My friend asked me about right-wing telling, and I told him and I told him that any tailing that established the status quo as it is would be effectively a move to the right, whether it is with the Republicans or the Democrats. Now, he continued to chastise me for being insufficiently electoralist enough and insufficiently anti-imperial, whatever he means by that. But I was struck by something, and I responded to him very clearly. Anti-imperialism is important. It is vitally important. But unfortunately, most people turn to it when they are unable to affect any change in their own society. Because their emotive attachment to ending something that seems beyond their control and thus signaling to others that they would end it becomes a belief that just mass rejection of the policy will end it. There is no historical evidence for that. In fact, I always used to tell the story about how protests were originally parts of peasants' army movements, and you would protest to prove you had the men and the ability to turn that into a fairly robust insurrectionary army. That was the signal. Civil disobedience and mass strikes was a way to move that away from the military insurrectionist metaphor. By the time of the 60s, it began to be a direct expression of power, or some people thinking it was something like direct action. Now, many of these words are so overused by leftists and people who call themselves leftists that it is hard to care if something is direct action or not, because almost anything can be labeled that if it involves you doing something directly. No. Protesting let off steam, but we all know when we study it, what ended the Vietnam War was the Viet Cong. We all know that the massive protests against the Iraq War did not end it. What ended it was a decade and a half of bleeding money. And the profitability for contractors seeming to be not as much on the horizon. And so this brings us now to this Ukraine situation. And the situation with the Democrats and the progressives and social democrats and democratic socialists, or whatever people want to brand themselves, as this moving of the Overton window has not changed much. What Twitter, which is a very, very small social media platform in the grand scheme of things that is largely organized around students and elites, not just the blue check marks either. The reason why it has become so important is because Twitter does not pay to play in the way Facebook does. People are slightly more honest and more negative on it because their identities are hidden, and it is given to very brief statements, which journalists can mine as somehow being meaningful statements of the current situation. It's a shortcut for people actually doing and understanding the larger class and material substrates of the world. It's also a way to pretend that optics and performativity is the primary mover of politics, which again emerges out of protesting. No, your beliefs, your anti-imperial beliefs, your socialist beliefs, all these things, they matter to you, but they don't matter to us. Not unless you have a program and a way to do something about it. And I don't mean advocating in a group of maybe 60,000 socialists. After all, the DSA in its period has taken more and more radical stances on foreign policy at the very moment that it has had no effect on domestic policy. Its attempt with coalitions with the Squad, its endorsed candidates have all failed it, and most specifically on the foreign policy it so particularly cares about. After all, the only thing the DSA was ever particularly unified on was BDS in regards to Israel, and even that has seen massive problems and continuing to hemorrhage members after yet another scandal, and indeed even losing 3 MPC members. No, that is not important, ultimately. If you want to canvass for progressive candidates, you should probably do so in a more efficient way. After all, corporate paymasters pay better, and they're more locally available. This dependence on your identification, on the media you listen to, on what you show on Twitter, on how you interact on Facebook, on whether or not you are a nominal member of the DSA, whether or not you show up to meetings even, this is irrelevant. After all, your politics is further away from anything accomplishable now than it even seemed under Trump and the great opposition to Trump. It seemed like so many things were possible because no one had responsibility. And in the lack of responsibility, they could tell you that they were willing to do whatever they thought would keep you loyal. I have learned that I did not understand a certain class of Democrats that well until recently. Now, yes, I've never trusted Democrats. I have registered to be a Democrat to vote for Bernie Sanders in the primary in a state that has close primaries, and that's it. I was a supporter of Mike Revelle in 2008 when I was a little bit younger and more deluded. I did not throw my support elsewhere when Obama became president. But even before he assumed office, my stomach sunk when I saw his cabinet, and I was surprised by nothing that happened later. No, but I was talking to a coworker who was sitting down to me and explaining to me why he was the person who thought Joe Biden was great because of the way he was handling Ukraine. And that he had inherited all these mistakes from the prior administration. Now, I, for one, don't actually think most U.S. policy, Republican or Democrat, is what's driving inflation. I actually think the evidence is that it is supply chain related and people opportunistically glomming onto that. After all, the share of worker compensation and overall profits has dropped since 2019, even as wages haven't increased, meaning that wages have no way kept up with even their former ratio of relationship to the amount of profits generated. Furthermore, as assets are inflated, profits are beginning to decline, and rents are beginning to seem like they are harder to get. The safety net, whether it was caused by animal spirits or direct policy created by QE, seems to be falling out of the market. And many bubbles and inflated assets are exploding. That hasn't hurt the dollar because there's still nothing to replace it. No matter what some person on the internet tells you about the ruble, what the exchange of the ruble is for, Putin's plan to enforce gas being paid in rubles, is so that Russia can get foreign currency that is useful for foreign exchange. That does not mean that Russia itself has become a foreign exchange currency. The Russian ruble is not held commonly in banks and will be used explicitly to buy gas. But it will probably keep the currency from completely tanking. No, that is not what you think it is. And again, the facileness of some of this shows. But we have to deal with what my friend told me today. My work friend. We were talking and he told me that Biden was a great president, that he handled Ukraine well. I was confused. I mean, yes, it was one of the few times where military intelligence in the United States and the CIA did not look to be completely making something up. And yes, Putin's troops, despite what some people want you to believe, have done less well than predicted. Not because the Russian army is completely ineffective, although its logistic trains may have lacked some desire, but because in reality, fourth generation warfare applies to everybody. And while an occupier can sustain and can inflict way more casualties and will, the asymmetry of what is being fought over means that it also will lose morale and have its logistics lines overstretched faster than people scrambling to survive. Many of my friends who've taken more pro-Russian positions have not liked me saying that, but then they thought the war would be over in a few weeks. Now, I was wrong, because while it has become clear that Zelensky has lost faith in joining NATO, and while it has become clear that the geostrategic objectives of keeping other countries out of NATO has completely been lost, it is also clear, and this some of my more pro-Russian friends were right about, that the United States is using this invasion to bleed Russia at the cost of the Ukrainians. Yeah, sure, there's a few leftists who get hard-ons when they hear about the Donbass, and while I'm not actually even unsympathetic to the separatist cause there, the irony of those separatist causes is that it consolidated Ukrainian identity. And even smashing the Azov battalion, back when everybody on the internet learned what that was, that identity is still pretty solid. You may go, well, denazification, but surely you are not stupid enough to believe that someone who would align with Modi's India is profoundly interested in denazification. At least not in a way that would mean what you think it means. No. What you see is a very limited military affair that is not going the way anyone predicted, because it became bigger in scope. And the West can funnel arms to maintain the conflict. An old strategy, one that they have done before. Now, I personally am not sympathetic to either side, but I want you people who supposedly care about peace, and you people who supposedly care about the left, to think about the implications of this. No. It is true that Russia is not a left-wing power, and if anyone convinces you of that, they are fools. Campism is the last refuge of people who don't have anything they can do in their own society. So they cheerlead something far away, something in which they don't have any skin in. And if they do, they'll probably change their opinion rather quickly. But furthermore, let's be honest, Ukraine also probably cannot win without direct Western help, which it will not get for the fear of nuclear war. So even if Russia is unable to achieve its military objectives in Crimea, which is almost a given that it will, and the Donbass and Luhansk region, which is not as given, and even maybe what the space chief said of wiping Ukraine off the map, if those military objectives are not achievable, it does not mean that Ukraine will be a functional society when it is over. So why then did the Democrats unanimously support not just what Biden asked for support for Ukraine, but actually upped it to $40 billion, which, by the way, is only a few billion short of everything they've committed to climate change, and only a few billion short of what Elon Musk threw at Twitter? No, you have to ask yourself, and really ask yourself, does your opinion matter? Can you stop the Democrats from voting from this war? Did they change your public opinion in 2004 in the Iraq war? No, not in the least. There was another decade to go. So why do you think public opinions in elections matter? Even when the Democrats came in on an anti-war platform in 2006, and Obama won on a limited anti-Iraq war platform in 2008, it still took a long time for anything to really be wound down. And then the war in Afghanistan, which was an even more disastrous war, was maintained until last year. A war that lasted long enough for it to drink. See, my friend told me that, and then he told me about how Trump made him understand that George Bush really wasn't that bad of a president. And he even recounted, and then I understood his class background more than I ever had before, that one of his family members had introduced him to Bush once. And I realized many, many things. The consensus of people who come from families who make over $100K a year is a lot more steady than people think. Are you angry at them? Are you angry at their opinions? Whether or not you like them personally, that is irrelevant. Have you thought about this politics? Then why on earth have you thought that you could take the party and enter it and change it? After all, you're not paying their bills. You're not getting them reelected. You're not keeping them in their job. And before you go and think that you can go tail the Republicans and get better results, yes, 52 Republicans opposed this Ukrainian budget, but that's even smaller number than the number of Democrats that opposed the Iraq war in 2002. The appropriations for that war and the authorization was at least a majority of Democrats voting against it, although most of the important ones, including Clinton and Biden, voted for it. Now, let's talk about Roe v. Wade for a second, something that I've been hesitant to talk about. No, abortion will not become illegal in all the United States. Yes, it will become illegal probably in at least 27 states, if not 30 to 31. Yes, that will be bad for women's health. People will die. I do not want to downplay that. But I've been listening to people talk about how voting for Hillary Clinton would have changed this outcome without dealing with the fact that the Republicans still controlled the Senate and would have under almost every prediction, even if she had won and things had not gone the way they went in Wisconsin. Would she have been able to change or get her own candidates through, or would they stall like they did under Obama? In addition, her vice president voted for Amy Coney Barrett. No. A symbolic vote was taken today, and of course it went down because not even all the Democrats would support an anti-abortion bill, but they would definitely all support this expansion in Ukraine. Even Ro Khanna, who voted against lethal aid in February, didn't do a damn thing today. Not the squad. Nobody. Now, I have no love for Vladimir Putin. I have no illusions about the politics of the Russian Federation. I do not think there is a clear anti-imperial side in these two camps in this war, nor do I think even that the supposed support of China for Russia is anything more than superficial and maintained primarily because politically China does not want to cave to Western powers in its upswing, an upswing that, frankly, it is beginning to have trouble continuing momentum towards between zero COVID and many other problems. Last time China saw downstream, by the way, there was hotness on the border. And despite India and China maintaining a similar policy to Russia, they have not really undone their hostility to each other. No. You don't have control of these nations. Your posturing on Twitter about your anti-imperialism doesn't do a damn thing about the actual reality of this, and you need to wake up to that. You cannot tail the Democrats. You cannot run progressive candidates under their banner and think it won't end up the same way. I hesitate to remind you that Nancy Pelosi was a progressive, that the mayor of Oakland was a Maoist, that these Democratic figures used to be radicals, more radical than people in the DSA today. And yet look at where they're at. It is time for you to go it alone, because the more you pretend as any kind of socialist or leftist that you can influence these parties, the more you are nullifying yourself, the more you pretend that moving the Overton window amongst 40-somethings is enabling socialism, when the policies that you advocate are not even as radical as progressives in the 1990s who lost pathetically, admittedly. What do you think you're doing? Sure, there's just not Electoral on a magazine. Sure, there's people who call themselves democratic socialists now who run the nation. Let me tell you, go read a newspaper column. Even in liberal newspapers, the commentary since the end of COVID before Biden to now has gotten much more reactionary. You want to understand the id of the older generations in America? You don't read Twitter, you read newspaper comments. No, it is not good for you. No, they're not representative of the average opinion, but it is a representative of the mood of a certain kind of person. The mood is shifting against this left. And I would like to say it's the left's fault, but the left has abdicated in any responsibility, whatever the left is. And frankly, as I said on Twitter today, the left is so many different things and so many people trying to claim it that it's essentially meaningless to say what the left is in America. Becomes a signifier more of what you are against than what you are for. And even what you are against is not clear. It is always shifting and moving. But when someone tries to look at data about the Great Resignation and says that, well, there are less Great Resignation people in blue states rather than red states, and then not look at unionization rates. And then they say, oh, yeah, it is unionization rates, but unionization rates are in democratic states. Well, outside of New England, that's not particularly true. And California is an outlier. California had high great resignation rate, not as high as the industrial Midwest, no, but it has a high population and a lot of rich people in it who probably weren't leaving their jobs. No. What this meant was that the fact that there was an inculcated union stronghold that made jobs better in New England, an area that is a very small portion of the country and with jobs that are a very small portion of the workforce, did mitigate against the worst conditions that happened at the end of COVID. But that hasn't stopped or even explained why union membership in already existing unions is still declining. No. That is also tailing to the right. Just because it is in Jacobin magazine and not in Compact magazine doesn't mean it is not a compromise which is undermining your politics. You need to go it alone. If there are factions in the DSA, you want the DSA to really split and become an independent identity, then those are the factions you take seriously or none at all. You need a political program around which to unify and a social program to build that political program out of. You need organizations. Before you even need a party, you don't need factions trying to pretend that a squabble amongst a bunch of people who are free labor for the Democratic Party is the future of the left. You don't have a seat at the table. And frankly, you don't have a seat at the table almost anywhere in the world. In India, the left is marginalized. In Europe, the left is increasingly marginalized. In Canada, the left is subsumed to the Liberal Party. In the UK, Labour is not that left anymore and also is a permanent opposition party no matter how bad Boris Johnson screws up. Like his successors that screwed up, he will probably be replaced with a different faction and flavor and bloat of Tory. No, you are not at the table because you have not tried to rebuild an independent society, and you can't do that because you won't admit the conditions in which you exist in. The left should not be a debate society. It should not be a media project. It should not be this, that, or the other. If you have work to do, you figure out what the work you need to be. How do you build a society that creates autonomy for the people who you care about, people who can sustain themselves, and not just promote a new elite to be captured by the old elite and just pushed in front to make everything look more diverse? If you don't have just as much anger at people who were nice to the Democrats as you do to people who have become nice to other non-socialist formations, and are you really against the status quo? They're not going to give you healthcare. They're not even going to fix the universities, because even if they forgive all the student loans, which would not be enough, they have no ability to pass a program to reform the entire system. Nor, if they made universities free, would they deal with the ever-expanding administration bloat and the lack of efficacy in these schools. You can't pour new wine into old wineskins. It bursts. The left is not responsible for the situation it is in because it's not even had a clear enough mission to fail. You're not going to stop the Roe v. Wade thing by protesting. You're not going to stop the Ukraine war by protesting. You're not going to stop this by voting for a few candidates who you can barely afford. You have to start building organizations and means to do what you need to do. If you vote, it should be for a specific reason and not for candidates, but for policies. And those policies should be to better enable you to build the organizations you need to then build a meaningful program and, if need be, build a party. And by a party, I do not mean the kind of shit that you see in the sectarian left now or some mass bullshit identification party that's tied into the states for formal sorting. I mean an old party, one that we have not seen, well, in America since the socialist and communist parties. And even then, they were problematic. And I don't just mean that in the common way. I am angry. Our elites have failed us. Our bourgeoisie doesn't even seem visible. Our left is making excuses for the status quo, whether it realizes it or not, and our right is pretending to be anti-systemic when it just wants a different part of the status quo in place. No, not acceptable. A friend pushed me on Twitter, and a fan, actually, a subscriber to the show even, asked me, why I thought that nuance and whatnot was important. When he said nuance will get you killed, I'm like, yeah, but if you have two sides that are just going to chew you up and spit you out, picking one of those sides is not adaptive in the long run. They're still going to eat you. What you have to do is build the conditions for your own side to emerge. Start building. That's why I've been changing to a more positive note. That's why I've been changing the way I talk about this. What kinds of conditions reinforce positive social feedback? What enables people to discipline themselves, not have others discipline them? That does not help you. But to be your own regulator, to work cooperatively, to act together, to have solidarity, but to do so in a way that is not dependent on your victimization, on just asking for others to give you something more. You do not ask. You free yourself. Good day. Blah, 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 like and subscribe. Hit the bell. Whatever.